In 1943, Allied intelligence received a message so alarming, it was locked behind 3 levels of clearance. Nazi Germany was weeks made beadies from building a weapon powerful enough to turn every major Allied city into ash. The only way to stop it, a suicide mission. Carried out by 6 commandos, dropped into the deadliest winter Europe had seen in 50 years. No backup, no extraction, no second chance. Their objective, infiltrate a fortress carved into a mountain, slip past floodlights, patrols, minefields, and destroy a secret facility the Nazis believed was untouchable. Every calculation said the mission would fail. Every man who volunteered knew he might not come back. What they didn't know was that the real danger wasn't inside the fortress. It was the betrayal waiting on the other side. World War II was a battlefield of nations, but some of its most decisive moments happened far from the front lines. In frozen valleys, inside hidden bunkers, in the shadows where no medals were ever awarded, and where the smallest team could change the fate of millions. By 1943, the Allies were running out of time. Nazi Germany wasn't just conquering land, they were hunting for ultimate power. A superweapon that, if completed, could wipe entire cities off the map to stop. The Allies didn't send an army. They sent ghosts, men hand-picked for impossible missions, trained to move silently across snow-covered mountains, to strike deep behind enemy lines, and disappear before anyone realized what had happened. These were operations so secret that even Allied commanders doubted they would succeed. Missions were one wrong step, one loose whisper, one flicker of light in the dark, meant certain death. Yet again and again, these small teams delivered results that shaped the course of the war. Their stories were hidden for decades, classified, redacted, forgotten. Today, we uncover one of the most daring of them all. A mission executed in silence, fueled by desperation, and remembered as the moment when a few brave men changed history before the world ever knew it. By the winter of 1942, the war had reached a point where nations weren't just fighting for territory, they were fighting for time. Every week, every month, every battlefield loss pushed the Allies closer to a terrifying possibility that Nazi Germany might unlock a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen, a weapon that could erase a city before the echo of the explosion even faded. What few people understood back then, what only a handful of scientists and military planners truly recognized, was that the future of the war no longer depended on tanks rolling across Europe or fleets battling in the Atlantic. It depended on chemistry, on physics, on the strange and delicate science of nuclear fission. Hitler's regime had begun a race for the atomic bomb. Their top scientists, led by Werner Heisenberg, the same Heisenberg who shaped the laws of modern physics, believed they could create a device powerful enough to force the world to its knees. If they were right, the war would be lost long before American troops could reach Normandy, long before the industrial might of the US could turn the tide. A single German bomb detonated over London, New York, or even Washington would end everything. And so the Allies turned their attention to a single chilling question. How close were the Nazis? The answer arrived through coded radio intercepts, courier reports, and whispers from resistance groups across Europe. Bit by bit, a puzzle formed. A disturbing picture emerged. The Germans weren't just researching nuclear power, they were actively trying to build a sustainable reactor. a stepping stone to the bomb. And to do it, they needed something extremely rare. Something so uncommon that only one place in the entire world produced enough to matter. Heavy water. A strange, dense form of water used to slow neutrons and control chain reactions. To most of the world, it was irrelevant. To nuclear scientists, it was priceless. With enough heavy water, a reactor could run efficiently. Without it, the Nazis' atomic dream would collapse overnight. That's when Allied intelligence discovered the truth. Germany was pulling massive shipments of heavy water from a single factory in Norway, a remote industrial giant called Vemork, built into the side of a mountain, protected by cliffs, guards, and brutal Arctic cold. The news hit American and British analysts like a shockwave. If the Germans succeeded in activating a full reactor, they could extract plutonium. Once they had plutonium, a bomb was not hypothetical. It was inevitable. Suddenly, battle lines and frontiers seemed insignificant compared to the silent war. Being fought in laboratories and hidden facilities, the United States had already launched its own atomic project, the Manhattan Project, but it was still in its early phases. Factories were being built, materials were being searched for, teams were untested. In contrast, Germany had a head start, and a ruthless willingness to sacrifice anything to win the race. American generals, British scientists, and intelligence. Officers gathered in dimly lit rooms, poring over grainy photographs of the Vemork plant. Everyone in those rooms understood the stakes. If Germany reached the bomb first, the war would end, not with victory parades, but with mushroom clouds. That realization shifted the war in a way few civilians ever knew. Churchill called heavy water the most important liquid in Europe. Roosevelt authorized covert operations deeper than anything the OSS had attempted before. And across the Atlantic, American military planners agreed. This was no longer a conventional war. This was a scientific arms race, one measured not in divisions or aircraft, but in liters of heavy water. And yet, despite all the urgency, all the intelligence, all the planning, the Allies knew they had almost no options. They couldn't storm the plant. They couldn't bomb it. Previous attempts had missed entirely. They couldn't sabotage. It was spies. The facility was too heavily guarded, too remote, too fortified. So the Allies asked themselves a different question. If we can't attack it with an army, could we destroy it with a handful of men? Men who knew the mountains? Men who could move like shadows across frozen plateaus? Men who could survive where no soldier was meant to survive? And that was when the idea first surfaced, an idea so audacious, so unlikely, that even intelligence officers hesitated to say it aloud. A small Norwegian team, parachuted into the wilderness, tasked with destroying the most valuable industrial target in Europe. The race for the ultimate weapon had begun, and the fate of cities across the world now rested in the hands of a team so small. Their names could fit on a single scrap of paper. High in the mountains of Norway, where the winter sun barely lifts itself above the horizon, stood a place the Allies would come to fear, a place built not as a fortress, yet defended like one, the Vemork heavy water plant. To the outside world, it looked like nothing more than an industrial complex, pipes, chimneys, stairwells, and thick concrete walls. But to Allied intelligence, Vemork was a ticking bomb, quietly feeding the Nazi nuclear program with the one substance they desperately needed: heavy water. The plant sat on a plateau carved by glaciers, surrounded by cliffs that dropped hundreds of feet straight down. Only one road led to it. Only one bridge crossed the ravine. And German soldiers guarded both day and night. Floodlights swept across the snow like blades of white fire. Machine gun nests watched the approach roads. Mines were buried along the hillside. And in the valley below, patrols moved like clockwork. American analysts later described it as a fortress nature built and Germany perfected. The British Air Ministry studied aerial photos and reached a painful conclusion. An airstrike might hit the roofs, but never the production chambers, buried deep inside. Previous bombing attempts had proven that. Planes returned with empty payloads, their crews shaken by flak and blinding weather. Not a single bomb had damaged a critical pipe. So the Allies examined the map again. The cliff was too steep, the snowstorms too violent, the guard posts too well positioned. Every approach looked like a death sentence. If an army marched on the plant, it would be massacred. If a small squad tried to climb the ravine, it would vanish in the wind. And yet, destroying Vemork wasn't optional. It was mandatory. American physicists reviewing intercepted German messages warned that the factory's output was increasing. If the Nazis reached full reactor capability, they could produce enough material to build a nuclear device. Perhaps within a year, some estimates were even shorter. For Allied command, this was unacceptable. The idea of Hitler holding a weapon, of unimaginable power weapon that could level London or choke New York in radioactive fire sent chills through every briefing room. But Vemork was more than a military threat. It was a symbol of German confidence, a statement: we are protected, we cannot be touched. And the longer it stood untouched, the closer Germany came to proving that statement true. Churchill demanded options. Roosevelt wanted answers. British SO officers pored over intelligence files, frustration building as every plan failed on paper before it could even reach the field. Naval bombardment? Impossible. Armored raid? No route. Airstrike? Already proven useless. Partisan uprising? The locals were strong, but the garrison was stronger. And so, almost reluctantly, the Allies acknowledged the truth. If Vemork could be destroyed at all, it would have to be done quietly, precisely, by men who could move through the wilderness, like shadows. Men who understood the terrain better than any German officer. That realization shifted the entire strategy. The fate of the atomic race would not rest with divisions or battalions, but with a small, specialized strike team, Norwegians trained, abroad, hardened by exile, and fueled by the hope of reclaiming their homeland. From an American perspective, it was almost unbelievable. One of the most important missions of the entire war would be carried out not by armies, but by a handful of men on skis, men who would be dropped into the coldest wilderness in Europe and asked to strike at the heart of the Nazi nuclear machine. Vemork was more than a target. It was a challenge, a dare hurled at the Allies by both nature and man. And soon, that dare would be answered. To sabotage Vemork, the Allies didn't need soldiers. They needed ghosts, men who could slip through a frozen wilderness, cross enemy territory without being seen, and survive in conditions that would kill most trained troops within days. It was a mission too delicate for paratroopers, too dangerous for engineers, too remote for commandos trained in London or Washington. Only one group of men fit the profile: Norwegians who had escaped the occupation and were willing to risk everything to win their homeland back. These weren't elite operatives or decorated war heroes. Most of them had been farmers, students, machinists, hunters, ordinary civilians, until the Nazis took their country. What made them extraordinary was something no military school could teach. They grew up in the mountains. They learned to ski before they learned to walk. They knew how to find food in a snowstorm, how to navigate by stars or wind patterns, how to blend into a landscape of endless white. When the British so began its search, they didn't look for strength. They looked for resilience. Men who didn't panic. Men who didn't boast. Men who accepted hardship the way other people accept the cold morning air. Interviews took place in small rooms in Scotland, far from the front lines, where officers looked the candidates in the eye and asked a simple question: if this mission kills you, are you still willing to go? Each man gave the same answer: yes. Their training was brutal in its simplicity. Long-distance skiing with full packs, navigation drills across Scottish highlands, explosives, practice in abandoned quarries, silent movement, hand signals, night infiltration. Everything they learned was designed for one purpose: get in, place charges, get out, and survive long enough to report success. But the real test wasn't physical, it was psychological. They were told the truth: the success rate for missions like this was almost zero. If captured, the Germans would treat them as saboteurs, not soldiers. There would be no protection under the Geneva Convention, no prison camp, no mercy, yet none of them hesitated. They had seen their towns burned, watched neighbors arrested, heard stories of families torn apart by occupation. Every man on the team had someone back home living under German rule, and that made their resolve unshakable. When the final roster was assembled, the briefing officer delivered a message that stayed with them. You are not just soldiers. You are the thin line between Hitler and the atomic bomb. If you fail, the war may take a turn from which we cannot recover. And so, this small band of Norwegian savage in appearance, silent in demeanor, hardened by laws, became something far greater. They became the ones the Allies trusted most, the ones the Germans would never see coming, the ones history would one day call the gunner-side team. These men were not chosen because they were perfect. They were chosen because they were willing, because they were stubborn, because when the moment came to volunteer for a mission that offered almost no chance of survival, they stepped forward, not for glory, not for medals, but for home. Before the Norwegian saboteurs ever set foot near Vemork, the Allies attempted a different plan, one that would cast a long, dark shadow over everything that came after. It was called Operation Freshman, and on paper it was bold, precise, and meticulously engineered. In reality, it became one of the most tragic failures of the entire war. The plan was straightforward. 2 British airborne teams, transported by gliders, would land near the plant. Royal engineers would break into the facility and destroy the heavy water cells. They carried specialized equipment, explosives, maps, and tools built specifically for Vemork's unique structure. The teams were highly trained, confident, and ready. But the mission depended on one thing: perfect weather. And in Norway, in November, such a thing barely existed. On the night of the operation, the aircraft carrying the gliders ran into brutal winds. Snow hammered their windscreens. Ice formed on control surfaces. The pilots fought to keep altitude, while the heavy gliders strained behind them like anchors dragging a ship into the deep. The first glider vanished from radar. No distress call, no signal, just silence. It crashed somewhere in the mountains, killing several men instantly. Those who survived the impact were captured within hours by German patrols. They were injured, unarmed, and completely isolated. But instead of humane treatment, they faced something far worse. Hitler's commando order, issued months earlier, declared that all captured commandos, regardless of uniform, were to be executed without trial. And so, the wounded survivors of the first glider were shot, not as prisoners of war, but as warnings. The second glider fared no better. Its towplane crashed after severe icing. The glider smashed into the ground shortly after. More British soldiers died instantly. The few who crawled from the wreckage were hunted down, interrogated, and ultimately executed, all under the same brutal order. This was the moment Allied planners realized the full cost of failure. The men of Operation Freshman had volunteered with courage equal to any hero of the war. But their sacrifice ended not in triumph, but in tragedy swept away by wind and snow. For the Norwegian resistance waiting in the mountains, the news hit like a hammer. They had listened for aircraft across the silent plateau, hoping for the hum of vengeance that never came. When the truth arrived, crashes, captures, executions, it confirmed their worst fear. Vemork was not just a difficult target, it was a death trap. And yet, something remarkable happened. The disaster didn't break the morale of the Norwegian team. It strengthened it. The losses of Operation Freshman hardened their resolve, transforming the mission from strategic necessity into something deeply personal. They understood now that failure meant not just the loss of their own lives, but the deaths of anyone who tried after them. If they didn't stop the heavy water production, no one else might even get close. The Germans, emboldened by their success, increased patrols around the plant. Searchlights doubled. Reinforcements arrived. The ravine was watched more closely than ever. But even with all this, they celebrated too early. Because while Operation Freshman had failed, it had created the one thing the next team needed most, a reason to succeed at any cost. And somewhere in the frozen darkness of the Hardangervidda plateau, 6 Norwegian ghosts were preparing to do what an entire airborne assault could not. In the aftermath of Operation Freshman, the mission to destroy Vemork might have seemed cursed. The Germans tightened security. The winter deepened, and the Allied High Command knew the next team sent in would be on their own. No gliders, no backup, just survival skills. And the frozen wilderness. This advanced team for young Norwegians was given a simple code name, Grouse. Their task was far from simple. Parachute into the Hardangervidda plateau. Locate a safe area for a future sabotage team to land and survive until help arrived. No one knew how long that would take. A week, maybe 2. In reality, it became months. When their parachutes opened over the plateau, the wind nearly tore them from the sky. Snow swallowed them waist deep the moment they landed. Supplies scattered. Food lost. The temperature plunged well below freezing, and the plateau offered no shelter but rocks, caves, and the endless white. They hiked for miles, skis strapped to their packs, searching for a place to hide. The Germans were everywhere, Now patrols, sweeping the valleys, looking for any trace of Sabotage. So the grouse team vanished into the mountains, surviving in the only ways they knew: hunting birds, digging into snowdrifts for warmth, melting ice for water. Some days they ate nothing. Other days, a tiny ptarmigan bird became a feast. Their radio, their only link to Britain, barely worked. Storms cut off communication for days at a time. They built antennas from scrap wire and broken parts, raising them into the icy wind with numb fingers, praying for a signal. But mostly, they waited in silence, waited through storms that howled like living creatures, waited with the knowledge that the enemy was hunting them. And then, the waiting became a nightmare. They expected reinforcements within days. But Operation Freshman's failure meant no one was coming. Planes grounded, parachute drops cancelled, every new attempt blocked by weather or intelligence concerns. Weeks turned to months. The grouse team grew, thinner faces hollow, eyes darkened by sleepless nights and hunger. Yet something remarkable kept them alive: purpose. They knew why they were there. They knew what was at stake. And even half-starved and frostbitten, they refused to abandon the mission. They trained daily, skiing miles through the storm to keep their bodies from failing. They moved camps constantly, forcing the Germans to search empty valleys. They studied the land around Vemork until they could navigate it blindfolded. And then, on a night when hope felt nearly gone, a radio signal came through the static. 6 more Norwegian commandos were coming. A new team. A second chance. And this time, nothing, whether hunger, fear, would stop them. The grouse men looked at one another with exhausted smiles. Their ordeal wasn't over. In many ways, it had just begun. But the mission was alive again. And now, they would no longer be alone in the shadows. The 6 reinforcement commandos, codenamed Gunnerside, parachuted into Norway on a moonless February night. Their boots struck the snow with muffled thuds, sinking deep into the icy crust. Above them, the aircraft vanished back into the darkness, leaving nothing but wind and silence. Ahead of them lay the most dangerous winter in Europe and the most important sabotage mission of the war. These men had trained for months in Scotland, skiing with heavy packs, blowing open doors in mock factories, learning how to survive in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. But no training track, no simulation prepared them for the hard Vida plateau. It stretched endlessly, white and merciless, a landscape that swallowed sound and hope alike. Their first task was simply to find the grouse team. That meant skiing for days through blizzard conditions so fierce their eyelashes froze together. Visibility dropped to feet, not yards. Each man carried nearly 30 pounds of gear: explosives, food rations, radios, weapons. Frostbite chewed at hands and feet. One wrong turn could send them into a ravine. One misjudged step, and they would vanish beneath an avalanche. And yet, step by step, mile by mile, they pushed forward. At night, they dug trenches into the snow for shelter. They melted ice in tin cups over tiny stoves, sipping the warm water as if it were a luxury. Their morale depended on disciplined talk: little move steadily, conserve everything. After days of this brutal journey, through whipping winds and unending white, they finally saw it, a thin column of smoke rising from behind a cluster of rocks. The signal, the grouse team. What followed was more than a reunion. It was a transformation. For starving ghosts emerged from a cave, barely recognizable thin faces, ragged beards, eyes burning with determination. The gunnerside men rushed forward with food and supplies. For the first time in months, the grouse team ate a real meal. For the first time in days, the gunnerside team felt warmth from something other than a stove, hope. That night, in the dim glow of a small stove, the 10 men spread maps across the ground. They studied the terrain around Vemork's cliffs, guard posts, patrol routes. They analyzed the factory layout, memorizing hallways, stairwells, and the location of the electrolysis chamber. And then they crafted a plan bold enough to defy every rule of military doctrine. They would infiltrate Vemork through the ravine place. The Germans believed no sane man would traverse in winter. It was a plan built on risk, precision, and a kind of courage that bordered on madness. But in that icy cave, as the wind screamed outside, the men understood something clearly. No one else was coming. No army, no aircraft, no reinforcements. The fate of the atomic race rested on the 10 of them. And so they prepared quietly, methodically, relentlessly for the impossible. As the gunnerside team finalized their plan, one fact stood above all others. Vemork was built to be untouchable. It was not merely a factory, it was a fortress shaped by nature, sharpened by engineering, and guarded by the most disciplined occupying force in Europe. The plant sat like a titan on a sheer cliff, its windows glowing faintly against the endless snow. Below it, the ravine split the mountains like a wound carved by ice and centuries. A river raged at the bottom, frozen at the edges, black and violent at its core. The sides were almost vertical frozen walls of rock, slick with ice, impossible to climb without ropes, spikes, or miracles. The Germans believed the ravine was impenetrable. They built their defenses accordingly. The main bridge heavily guarded, machine guns pointed toward every approach, spotlights sweeping the plateau in slow, tireless arcs. Miners and technicians worked inside under the protection of a garrison confident that no commando team could reach the plant quietly. And that confidence was the opening. In the small, dark cave where the saboteurs huddled, the maps were clear. Attacking from the front was suicide. Attacking from above was impossible. Attacking from the valley floor required traversing the ravine the Germans ignored because they assumed no human would dare. That was precisely why the Norwegians chose it. On the night of February 27th, the wind cut across the plateau like a blade. The men strapped on their skis, packed their explosives, and moved under cover of darkness. Every sound mattered. Every footstep mattered. Snow-muffled movement, but the cold amplified breath, metal, fabric, every detail had to be managed with absolute discipline. When they reached the edge of the ravine, they stared down into a void that looked bottomless. Moonlight struggled to reach the river below. The drop was lethal. But this was their path. Removing their skis, they began to descend. Their hands, cold and stiff, gripped exposed roots and cracks in the frozen stone. Boots searched for footholds that crumbled under pressure. At one point, an entire slab of ice sheared off, tumbling into the darkness, the sound swallowed by the wind. No one spoke. Speaking was pointless. Breathing was a luxury. Inch by inch, they descended the cliff, then crossed the silent river at its narrowest, where ice barely held their weight. On the far side, they climbed again, this time into a steep, snow-choked slope behind the factory, a place German guards never bothered to watch. By the time they reached level ground, every man's lungs burned, their legs trembled, their fingers felt numb and useless. But they had done it. They were behind Vemork's defenses. and not a single German patrol had seen them. The impossible terrain had become the perfect disguise. And now, for the first time, the saboteurs stood closer to the heart of Hitler's nuclear program than any Allied force had ever come. The next phase would be even harder, because now they had to get inside. Once the commandos reached the rear of the plant, they faced the most delicate stage of the mission: infiltration. Ahead of them stood thick concrete walls, windows lit with the soft glow of machinery, and the muffled movement of German guards on their nightly rounds. There was no room for error, no second chance. If one guard spotted movement or heard a misplaced step, the entire team and the mission would be wiped out. But the Norwegians had discovered something extraordinary during their months of reconnaissance. A forgotten relic of the plant's early construction. A narrow cable tunnel used to bring power lines and equipment into the facility. It was not on German patrol maps. It was not guarded. It was their doorway. They found the entrance half buried in snow, a rusted metal hatch frozen from years of neglect. The men brushed it clean with gloved hands, careful not to strike metal against metal. Sound carried far in the cold. One spark could ruin everything. With slow, deliberate movements, they pried the hatch open. Cold air rushed out, mixed with the faint smell of dust and old wiring. The tunnel was narrow, so tight that the men had to crawl on elbows and knees, dragging satchels of explosives behind them. Their breath echoed against the metal walls. Their boots scraped softly on the frozen floor. Every sound felt too loud. Above them, footsteps approached. German guards crossed the walkway overhead, talking, laughing, unaware that the enemy was inches below their feet. The commandos froze, waiting for the voices to fade. In that moment, time stretched thin. Even the slightest cough could mean death. After minutes that felt like hours, they pushed deeper into the tunnel until they reached the far ender, thin wooden wall separating them from the basement level of the plant. This was the barrier between stealth and execution. Using a small saw, one of the men began cutting through the boards, each stroke quiet and precise. Beads of frost formed on his eyelashes. The others watched the hallway beyond through small cracks in the wood, ensuring no guards approached. Finally, the last sliver of wood gave way. The men slipped through into the basement, landing silently on concrete. The hum of machines grew louder, the heavy water production lines working non-stop to feed the Nazi nuclear dream. They moved through the basement like phantoms, knowing the electrolysis chamber was only a few corridors away. Pipes rattled, steam hissed from valves, shadows danced beneath the dim factory lights. Somewhere above them, guards patrolled. Workers checked gauges. The entire facility pulsed with life. And in that moment, in the cold, dim, echoing heart of the plant, the saboteurs knew the next few minutes would determine the future of the war. They had entered the fortress. Now they had to destroy it. Inside the basement of Vemork, the air felt warmer, but no safer. Pipes rattled overhead, valves hissed like angry serpents, and the low drone of machinery vibrated through the concrete floor. Every sound reminded the saboteurs that they were deep inside enemy territory, in the heart of Germany's most protected scientific asset. The team split into two small groups. One would act as lookout, posted near the stairwell where German guards occasionally passed on their rounds. The other carried the satchels, carefully packed explosives designed to cripple the electrolysis chambers without damaging the surrounding town. They moved through the basement like surgeons entering an operating room. Precise, calm, focused, when they reached the electrolysis hall. The sight was overwhelming. Giant cylindrical cells, steel pipes, and shimmering tanks that held the precious heavy water. The room glowed faintly with a bluish light, reflecting off metal surfaces like an otherworldly heartbeat. This was the engine of the Nazi nuclear project. Destroying it would cripple their atomic dream. The saboteurs set to work immediately. Each explosive charge was wrapped in a heavy, protective casing to direct the blast inward. Fuses were cut with gloved hands, measured down 2 seconds. The men moved in silence not because they feared noise, but because they respected the gravity of what they were doing. And then something unexpected happened. As one commando bent over a heavy water cell, a sound echoed through the hall, a soft creak, the unmistakable hinge of a door opening. The men froze. A factory worker stepped inside. He was Norwegian. For a moment, the world stood still. The saboteurs stared at him, unsure whether he would scream, run, or betray them. Instead, he simply looked at the explosives, then looked at the men, and gave a single, understanding nod. Without a word, he turned and closed the door behind him. The commandos resumed their work, hearts pounding but spirits steeled. They placed the final charges, double-checked each fuse, and laid a backup timed charge just in case the main one failed. Every step had been rehearsed countless times in Scotland, but now each action held the weight of millions of lives. When all was ready, the lead saboteur crouched down, lit the fuse with a small spark, and whispered a single phrase under his breath, "For Norway." The team slipped back through the basement, retracing their steps to the cable tunnel. Behind them, the explosives hissed softly as the fuse burned. Ahead, the winter night awaited, silent, dark, and unforgiving. They had planted the charges. Now they had to outrun history. At precisely 3:30 a.m., the Hardanger mountains trembled. The explosion ripped through the electrolysis chamber with violent precision, a controlled blast engineered to destroy the heart of the heavy water system without collapsing the entire plant. Pipes burst open like arteries, spraying steam and liquid across the room. Steel buckled. Machinery shrieked and tore apart under the pressure. Inside the factory, chaos erupted. German guards ran in every direction, shouting commands drowned beneath the roar of ruptured equipment. Smoke filled the corridors. The air tasted of metal and burning chemicals. In the confusion, the saboteurs' escape became invisible, their absence lost in the panic as alarms blared throughout the facility. But by the time the Germans understood what had happened, the commandos were already miles away, climbing into the mountains that had protected and punished them in equal measure. The blast had succeeded beyond expectation. The heavy water cells were destroyed. The room rendered useless. Production halted instantly. For the Allied High Command, it was a scientific miracle. For the Germans, it was a strategic disaster. And for the Norwegian saboteur, it was proof that the impossible could be achieved with courage, precision, and absolute determination. As dawn broke over the frozen landscape, the team pressed on skis, slicing through snow, breath turning to frost, legs burning with exhaustion. They knew the Germans would come. Search parties, tracking dogs, aircraft scanning the plateau. The entire region would soon become a net tightening around them. Yet they kept moving. Hours stretched into a day stretched into 2. Snowstorms battered them. Their rations dwindled. Their bodies screamed in pain. But they pushed forward because they understood something the Germans did not. The mountains were their home. Every ridge, every valley, every icy shadow was familiar territory. Meanwhile, back at Vemork, German engineers scrambled to assess the damage. The verdict came quickly: months of production lost, nuclear progress crippled, hope for an atomic breakthrough fading. The Germans found a pair of wire cutters and a single British-made rucksack left behind. Inside, a handwritten note: sorry for the damage. It was a message not of arrogance, but of purpose. A reminder that this was not an attack of hate, but of necessity. The saboteurs were no longer just fugitives. They were men who had struck one of the most decisive blows of the war, and now they had to survive long enough for the world to learn what they had done. The explosion at Vemork was only half the mission. Now came the part no one had truly prepared for: survival. The gunnerside team had just struck the most protected industrial target in Nazi-occupied Europe. Every soldier within 50 miles was hunting for them, and the winter wilderness, cold, vast, merciless, was no ally. As the commandos vanished back into the mountains, they moved with the same discipline that had carried them through the raid. They left no tracks where possible, climbed ridges to avoid predictable paths, and used storms as cover, knowing the same weather that froze their fingers could conceal their escape. German response was immediate. Search patrols spread across the plateau. Motorized units scanned the roads. Ski troops followed trails with trained dogs. Every farmhouse, every cabin, every fisherman's hut was interrogated. The order was clear: find the saboteurs, dead or alive. But the Norwegians were not ordinary fugitives. They were mountain men born in snow, raised on skis, hardened by loss. Where German soldiers struggled with cold and terrain, the commandos moved as if gliding across their childhood playground. Still, the challenges were relentless. They battled through blizzards so fierce they couldn't see the man skiing 10 feet ahead. They crossed frozen lakes that groaned beneath their weight. They rationed every crumb of food, melting snow for water, relying on endurance more than strength. As the team pushed deeper into the wilderness, they split into smaller groups to increase their chances. One group made contact with the Norwegian resistance and was smuggled toward Sweden. Another hid in mountain cabins, avoiding patrols that swept the valleys like iron brooms. And then there was the most legendary escape of all. One saboteur canoe Hawklid traveled more than 250 miles on skis. Alone, hunted, surviving on whatever the mountains offered. It was one of the longest solo escapes in the history of the war. He crossed blinding white plains, scaled icy ridges, and outpaced every German patrol sent after him. His journey became a symbol not just of courage, but of the sheer will to keep fighting. Meanwhile, the German command grew desperate. They questioned how a small team could infiltrate their fortress, destroy their most vital nuclear resource, and vanish without a trace. Their failure to capture even a single commando became a humiliation. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into freedom. One by one, the saboteurs reached safety, some in Sweden, others back with the resistance network. Not a single man was captured. Not one died in the escape. The mountains had become their shield. Their training had become their salvation. And their courage had just altered the future of the war. The world still had no idea what these men had done. But soon, history would. When the dust settled, scientists and intelligence officers examined the wreckage at Vemork. Their conclusion was immediate and unanimous. The Nazi nuclear program had been dealt a critical, possibly fatal blow. The electrolysis cells were gone. Months of heavy water reserves destroyed. Production halted indefinitely. German physicists scrambled to rebuild, but the timeline Hitler's most precious advantage was shattered. Then came the final stroke of fate. Months later, as the Germans attempted to transport the remaining heavy water across Lake Tinn, the Norwegian resistance struck again. Their ferry hydro was sunk deep beneath the lake's frozen surface. Every barrel of heavy water went with it. With that, Germany's nuclear dream died quietly in the cold. Historians would later agree that without Vemork, Germany never had a viable path to the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project would go on to succeed first, and the world we know today would be shaped by that sequence of events. But while the headlines of World War II speak of Normandy, Stalingrad, Midway, and the Bulge, the story of Vemork existed in shadows for decades. The men responsible received little recognition in their lifetimes. Most returned home, built ordinary lives, raised families, and moved on carrying the weight of what they had done quietly, without fanfare. And yet, their mission stands as one of the most precise, daring, and consequential acts of sabotage in military history. 10 men with skis and explosives accomplished what armies, bombers, and scientists could not. They changed the outcome of the nuclear race. They altered the direction of the war, and they did it without losing a single member. From an American perspective, the bravery of the gunnerside team protected countless cities: New York, Washington, Chicago, London. It prevented a world none of us want to imagine. As veterans of the mission grew older, some shared their stories for the first time. Others never spoke of it again. But all of them understood one truth. History often hinges on small groups, acting in silence, far from the roar of battle. Operation Gunnerside was not just a mission. It was a turning point. A reminder that courage is sometimes quiet, sometimes unseen, and sometimes it is the only line standing between freedom and the darkness that threatens to swallow it. These men were not legends when they started, but their actions made them so. And long after the war ended, long after the echoes of gunfire faded, the world remained safer because of what they chose to do on one frozen night in 1943. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world rushed to celebrate victory. Cities rebuilt. Flags were raised. Soldiers returned home to embraces they had dreamed of through years of darkness. But somewhere far from the parades, the mountains of Norway remained quiet. Only the wind remembered what had happened there. The men of Operation Gunnerside didn't march in celebrations. They didn't give speeches. They didn't claim glory. Most of them slipped back into ordinary lives. Teachers, farmers, mechanics, fathers. They never asked for medals, though they earned every single one, because what they fought for wasn't fame. It was the future. In the decades that followed, historians would dig through archives and declassified files. Only then did the world truly understand how close it had come, how dangerously close to a Nazi atomic bomb, and how a small team skiing through blizzards, starving in caves, crawling through forgotten tunnels, had stopped it. There's a line in the history of World War II that few people see, a moment where the fate of millions rested not on armies, but on 10 shadows moving through the night. If they had failed, if one fuse had misfired, if one guard had turned his head, if one storm had blown in stronger than expected, the world we know today might not exist. That is the weight of their story. Not just what they destroyed, but what they protected, what they preserved, what they saved. War often celebrates the loud, the tanks, the aircraft, the battles with names etched into stone. But this story, belongs to the quiet, to the men who fought in silence, who vanished into snowstorms, who left behind no monuments but the safety of the generations that followed. When you look back on the long, brutal years of World War II, remember this: sometimes history pivots not on the roar of cannons, but on the soft crunch of boots on snow, the hiss of a fuse in the dark, and the courage of a handful of men who refused to let darkness win. This is their legacy, not written in marble, but carried in the world they kept from falling apart. And though their footprints have long since faded from the Hardanger Plateau, the echo of what they did still lingers in the winter wind.